Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Hopcat. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Jennifer White. I'm Michigan Radio's host of All Things Considered. I realize that we may have a bit of a mixed crowd here this evening. There may be some folks here who have absolutely no idea what's going on. Issues in Ale is a way for us to reach out into the community and have conversations about what we're covering on the air in a more informal setting, thus the Ale part of the Issues and Ale conversation. This is the first Issues and Ale we're doing as part of our State of Opportunity project, which is a 3-year project funded by the Kellogg Foundation that examines how to make Michigan a better place for children in vulnerable communities. Children who are born into poverty, who are born into violence, how to make Michigan a place for them to succeed. So that's what this conversation is about today. We wanted to kick off our Issues in Ale for this series here in Grand Rapids, so thanks for coming out to join us. The way we're gonna do it, we'll talk to the panel for a while, but we'd also like for you to join the conversation. If you have a question you'd like to give to the panel, Steve Krupinski here has a microphone. That's Steve. And he will bring you the mic so that you can ask the question. We are recording this evening so that we can stream this on our website as well. So it's important that you actually be on the microphone when you ask the question. If you are in that back area, I think there are a few seats in this direction. There's sort of a half round table back there. If you want to scoot in a little bit, Michigan radio folks tend to be pretty friendly, so you could probably share tables if there are available seats as well. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We're joined this evening by Dr. Linwood Cousins. He is a director and professor at the School of Social Work for Western Michigan University. Linwood, welcome. Jim Crisp, next to him, he is the executive director of Michigan Community Action Agency Association, which is the state association of the community action agencies. They provide a range of human services programs for low-income individuals and families across the state. And finally, we're joined by Dustin Dwyer, who is one of the reporters on the State of Opportunity project. And I'm sure most of you all are quite familiar with Dustin's voice. And he's an incredible reporter. We're really glad to have him working on this project. So I'd like to start with a question we've sort of been grappling with when we started to tackle this project. And that's the perception we have of what it means to be poor. People tend to sort of stratify poor people into two groups. There are the good poor people who are hardworking and just can't get ahead, and then there are the bad poor who are just sort of living off the government dole. And policy often seems to respond to the bad poor, not the good poor. So I wanted to kind of get your feedback about how realistic those definitions really are and how close to reality they really are. Linwood, can we start with you?
I think maybe one of the efficient ways of thinking about it is to put it in the context of people you live with. You're considered poor by federal standards if you have a household of four people, and your income is roughly $22,000, $23,000 or below. So if you know people whose income is less than that, that's about $400 or $500 a week, more or less, then they fit the category of being poor. So you're talking about, more often than not, the majority of poor people are people who are working for a living. They're trying to make ends meet. They're not people who are, for all intents and purposes, living lives where they waste money, where they're involved in lifestyles that are detrimental to them. Instead, they're really hardworking people. They may not have the highest level of education, and they may not be highly skilled, so they aren't making a lot of money, but they are working and they're trying to make ends meet. And so it becomes difficult then to generalize in terms of the notion of bad people who are poor. I don't think most of them fit that category. And even when I might say you think of whatever you would call bad things, drinking, drugs, sex, the whole host of lifestyle issues, you have to ask yourselves, why is it that because your income is below a certain level, that you should pay a price for those things, when in fact the majority of our society is engaged more or less in those kinds of activities? So we end up punishing people because of their income based on a lifestyle that is essentially shared across the spectrum, not only in America but in the West. So that's...
Jim, you're on the ground and you work with individuals and families who are poor or living below the poverty line. Has that profile shifted in recent years? Are you seeing different kinds of people now having to access services in the current economic state?
Certainly, and we've heard the phrases like the new poor, which is basically folks who up to that point had considered themselves middle class. And it only takes one small hiccup in the system, whether it's somebody loses a job, there's a significant medical emergency, there's so many things that can plummet a family so quickly from what we call middle class to what we now call poor. Getting back to your original question of good poor and bad poor, I don't know who came up with that. It's all bad to be poor, and they're usually good people that are. It's quite often generational. It's quite often generational, and the idea here is that we need to break the cycle. And we've been studying this hard since the mid-'60s when Lyndon Johnson kicked off his war on poverty. We've got reports that we can look at every year. The reports usually don't change unless it's a worse picture. And the idea here is that, you know, if you're going to do all these reports, what are we going to do with them in order to turn it around?
Talking about reports, there was a recent report released that talked about the stickiness of poverty. You mentioned generational poverty. And there is evidence emerging that if you are born into poverty, it is incredibly difficult to escape it. And yet, we maintain a vision of America that is one in which you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you work hard and you apply yourself, that you can get ahead. How do we reconcile that vision of America with the reality of generational poverty? Anybody can tackle that one.
So, Jen, this is something that I researched as part of my reporting. You can get into a lot of statistics about how you define poverty, how you define people who are experiencing economic mobility. And I just did a story a week ago about how, in fact, most people in America do experience an economic mobility in the sense that they make more money than their parents. But there's another way of measuring that, which is to say, if your parents were in the bottom, say, quintile of economic groups, if they were at the bottom group, then are you also in that bottom group? You know, you take, and over time, if all incomes are growing, then if you imagine different income levels as sort of rungs on a ladder, the rungs move farther apart. You may make more money than your parents, but you are still in that bottom group. So what the research tells us, with the Pew Economic Mobility Project just released a report 2 weeks ago on, is that if you start out in that bottom rung, 40% of people remain in that bottom rung. Whereas if you start out, say, in the middle rungs, maybe only 20% stay in the same spot. So this is what they call stickiness at the ends. It's also true that if you start out at the top, you're more likely to stay at the top. So just from a purely data point of view, it is true that more people who sort of start out sort of in the lower economic levels end up there when they're adults.
I think it's also worth noting, a pretty good question would be to ask ourselves, does a child born into a particular situation, a poor family, that we know puts them on the trajectory, as you stated, to remain poor, is is that a circumstance we want to live with in America? We know that that is not accidental, that communities are influenced by schools, the quality of schooling that children would get, the quality of the social life that they would be exposed to. All of those things play into that trajectory, that pathway that we all know so well is going to happen, yet we accept it for some reason or another. Not to say that we aren't trying to do anything about it, but as you've said, we've been talking about that at least since, well, it actually goes before the 1960s. It can go back much farther than that, but we've been talking about that since the Great Depression. How is it that we stem some of the variables and attributes that we know are associated with predicting that a person and a family will remain in a lifestyle or in a condition where they'll be impoverished? I think we have to find it as unacceptable, even though it is true.
I have a question for the audience. Just by a show of hands, how many of you think that as a society, as a state, we can just contain it to Michigan, that there is enough support for people who live in poverty right now, that the state is doing enough, we are doing enough? Oh, wow.
Kind of crowd.
Wow, okay. How many people think that education is the most important factor in helping people escape poverty? Show of hands. What about jobs? Jobs, a couple people. What do the statistics show us? What is the most important factor that plays into helping people escape poverty?
Well, eventually it is the education that gets them the better job. I mean, a lot of the working poor right now are making minimum wage, and at that rate, they can't even afford to live in an acceptable dwelling for a family of four with minimum wage. So without a good education, and you know, it's the same thing we were all preached to as children, and I think the sermon remains the same. As you get a good education, it'll lead to other opportunities. So.
One of the things we're finding in this project is that there is an image that prevails about what it means to be poor. There is an image of the welfare queen or the drug addict who is taking advantage of the system. Why is that image so difficult to shake? Why is that such a powerful and enduring image?
I think it's an easy escape for those who don't want to support helping the less privileged. That's the quickest out, is to say that you've got all of these people who are milking the system, that are living off of welfare. I think certainly in a large way, starting with Engler, good or bad, I think he took care of a lot of that when he started eliminating the opportunities for many people and forcing them into other venues. Does that still happen? Sure. And when they find it, they'll play it. You know, it's a great sound bite, but it isn't real. If you look at the percentages, if you look at the real numbers, so many more people are trying so hard. They don't know how. A lot of them put forth all the effort, and they just don't know how to get out of there. And that's where we need to help. And education for youth is important, but we've got to start with the family too. We can't just concentrate on the youth, because they come from a situation that is often undereducated, underfed, don't have proper health insurance. There are so many issues that tax the family. And in order to get the children to the level they need to be, we've got to start with the whole family.
Well, what kinds of interventions work for the family, Jim? When you talk about taking that kind of holistic approach, what helps?
It's amazing how little can help. You know, the facts with regards to, for instance, the earned income tax credit, and the studies behind that nationally that show a few $100s a year makes such a huge difference in a family that's maybe making minimum wage or a little bit better, or maybe even a family of four that's making $20,000. So small programs like that don't seem like a whole lot of cash, can make all the difference in the world, and all of a sudden they've got enough money to buy a little more food, or to pay off that insurance bill, or to buy worthy transportation that can get them to and from a job. So there's so many different things, and each individual, I think, is different, and that's why, with respect to community action agencies, there's 30 of them, and there's 29 of them in the state. They service all 83 counties, and they're allowed the independence of when an individual comes in for help, what specifically does that individual need? And it's not always the same. In fact, it's quite often not the same. And maybe this family needs food assistance, or this family needs cash assistance, or this one needs help in saving for home, or have medical bills, or their utilities are going to be shut off, or their roof is leaking. I mean, there's so many things that can take a family's legs right out from under them. So it varies with who's coming through the door.
Dustin, I want to come to you for a second. As you've been covering this project and starting to talk to people who are struggling with poverty, who have small children, as a reporter, is it tricky to tell these stories? Do you find yourself trying to be very careful that the story that emerges isn't one that sounds like the stereotype? Is that hard?
It is. It can be. So I would say there's one of the problems I've had is that, we were just talking about stereotypes, and I think I was thinking as Jim was talking that one of the reasons I think people have stereotypes is because if you don't know that many people who are in that group, whatever group that may be, if you don't know that many rich people, you may have stereotypes about rich people. If you don't know that many people from Ohio, you might have stereotypes about Ohioans. So in my reporting, I've been going into people's homes and seeing them in their homes and meeting their children. And all these stereotypes you hear that either someone is a welfare queen or that they're sort of this broken hero that they're put upon, it just doesn't fit. I mean, everyone is an individual. Everyone has their own messy lives. And so those stereotypes break down pretty quickly. And what I would say is a challenge as a reporter is that, in order to talk about the issue in sort of a constructive way, we have to sort of maybe distance ourselves from it a little bit. But in order to sort of do the justice to the people who are in those stories, you can't just say, well, this statistic says that this person won't make it to college, because that's obviously not going to be the case for everyone you interview. And then the other thing is that even if someone's income qualifies them as sort of the poor, they don't necessarily identify that way. So one of the issues I had, I was doing a story and I was just talking about poverty, and then I mentioned this family that I had met, and the word poverty is not a word they would ever use to describe their situation. Although if you walked into their apartment, you might say, well, these people struggle to pay their bills, or they're trying to afford a little bit better. But so I guess the way that some people might talk about this issue is not the way that the people who are in the situation would talk about it. So finding that balance, and trying to sort of be honest about it is sort of where writing those scripts can be a little difficult.
When we first started the project, before we even really got to the reporting side of it, we did some research. We actually hired a company to go out, do some interviews with individuals who fell below the poverty line, to talk to them about their lives, to get a sense of what their concerns were. And yet, when we would ask them, how do you view yourself on the economic scale, they'd say, oh, working class, middle class. And rarely would they self-identify as being in poverty. At the same time, when we asked them what they wanted for their children, they would say, I want my kid to go to college. I want them to be successful. I want, these real aspirations for their children that we know from the statistics, the outcomes aren't likely with the circumstances being as they are right now. Why is it difficult for us, for our society, to come to terms with that truth when people who are in poverty don't identify that way? Doesn't it make it more difficult for them to advocate for themselves, to be able to step forward and be a voice for the life they're living and for other people like them. It seems like it gets more challenging because they don't want to identify that way.
I think your comments put a face on poverty. It really had me reminiscing. I grew up in a mixed income neighborhood in Virginia around lots of poor people, and within 3 to 4 blocks of 3 separate housing projects, Section 8, people who live in poverty. And my research approach is not quantitative, it's qualitative, or what I call ethnographic, meaning I live among the people. I try to live among the people that I study. And so the images and the questions that you raise about poverty, I think are accurate. And one of the issues we have, I don't think that I know the exact answer to, but one of the issues we struggle with in this country is an association of success with a certain moral standard. And in the 60s, the way we talked about that in academic circles was in terms of a culture of poverty. We thought that poor people were a part of a systematic way of living and a way of a set of values that were contrary to not only the Christian moral ethic, the Judeo-Christian ethic in America, but also contrary to the Horatio Alger, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of image. And that repeats itself when you ask people why they think poor people suffer the way they do. It tends to go back to lifestyle, which has to do with morality on the one hand, and motivation, which has to do with bootstrapping on the other hand. I don't know that we've overcome those sort of dominant ethics or dominant ways of thinking about why people are poor. I want to say one other thing, going back to your question about why we look at poor people the way we do sometimes. And I think that it would be foolish to deny that some of us, many of us, aren't able to distinguish in the demeanor of people, in the attitudes of people, those who come out of situations which are not middle class, upper middle class, and so on and so forth. But the question becomes, why do we then move from forming an image, drawing a stereotype, and drawing conclusions about what these people are worth and what kinds of opportunities they should or should not be afforded? That's where we get in trouble. It isn't that we draw judgment, it is that we act on the judgment in ways that limit people who need opportunity the most. I mean, they really need us to take risk with them in terms of employment, in terms of education, assets, investments, those sorts of things. They need us to help them move beyond where they are, but we refuse too often because of the very judgments you've mentioned. We look at them and we put them in a category of not being worthy of being helped.
Does that also contribute then to the increased concentrations of poverty we see? You look at urban centers that are really struggling, and if you look historically, there has been a historical disinvestment in those communities often. Does that also play into it? So as you have money leaving those communities, you lose a tax base for education, you lose jobs, you then lose the housing taxes. I mean, it all sort of snowballs downhill. Is that what we see happening in Michigan?
Well, certainly not in Michigan, but Michigan would be included in that. I say it's not just Michigan, but Michigan could be included in that scenario. I think the poor is a real easy group to pick on because they don't advocate for themselves a lot of times, which is why it's so important that we do that on their behalf to get them motivated. It's ironic that in our hardest economical times, that's the first group that starts to lose what little bit of a safety net they might have. Any support that they might have within a community starts to dwindle, and they're the first group to get hit and the last group to come back. And as such, it's hard to move them off of that base that they're on. As far as your community question, We see that in ethnicities and everything else. You gather in neighborhoods of groups that you're comfortable with or that you can relate to. And as that happens, it starts to expand, and you're right. The taxes go down, the schools go down, everything goes down, and people just are in a floundering situation, and if no one goes in there to help, it's going to continue. So.
Still, I think on a national level and in Michigan as well, it goes back to your earlier question. If you're able to identify poor people, then you're able to discriminate against them. And so what you find that in mobility patterns where you study, you look at the way people are able to move from neighborhood to neighborhood or from apartment to apartment, poor people are restricted often illegally by landlords and other people because of the assumption that they're poor, and with that poverty comes a lifestyle and things of that nature. So there's still a discriminatory aspect in society that limits the mobility of poor people. There are lots, I'm sure Jim and other, lots of single mothers and families that are considered poor who wanted to live in neighborhoods that are more heterogeneous in terms of income and education, but they're restricted. And the only places that will accept them are the communities that are dense with poor people. It's really problematic.
Having said that, the most recent census illustrates that Detroit's population, for instance, which many people would associate with a large urban poor community, has decreased significantly from the low income, and they were finding that there's an increase in low income families and individuals that have moved into the outer areas, whether it be Greater Wayne County or Oakland County or whatever the case may be. So there has been a population shift even of the poor. Don't know why that is. The report just came out. I don't think anybody's followed up on that, but it is interesting that they are breaking away from some of those larger urban pockets.
We want to invite everyone here to join into the conversation. If you have questions, if you have comments, again, Steve has a mic. We want to make sure we get you on microphone. If you want to add something to the conversation, please do. Oh, just raise your hand so he knows who you are. Thanks, Steve.
Hello? All right, perfect. I come from the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation here in Grand Rapids. I heard about a week ago a report on NPR specifying the 3 C's that people in poverty face: contracts, contacts, and capital. Coming from that idea and working through the entrepreneurship, most of our opportunity touch points to funnel people into this world of entrepreneurship are dominated by both male and white and rich people based on their social class. To me, it's not necessary the traditional sense of education as a way to get out of that realm and enter the world of business or whatever you want to do. It's more the focus on opportunities, both on your social network and anybody else that affects you or touches you in your life. That includes mentorships, that includes everything else. Maybe a focus on that could revitalize some of the areas that we're talking about today.
What about that? What about entrepreneurship and non-traditional routes to experience and potentially wealth? Is that something that has been overlooked in addressing this issue?
I think everything's been overlooked at this point. So certainly that has relevance. The topic that we've been mainly dwelling on today is childhood poverty, and when we talk education, when you find that, Michigan has lost so much ground on 8th graders being able to do math or 4th graders being able to read at their level, those basic skills are going to hold you back from including an entrepreneur. On the other hand, as the gentleman said, if you're moving beyond the childhood realm and we're looking at individuals who have that opportunity or are given that opportunity could excel, then certainly that's just another area, that we need to explore and needs to be developed. Absolutely.
I think you brought up an interesting question that is challenging to talk about when we talk about poverty, and that is the question of privilege. And this whole idea of stickiness on either end, either poverty or wealth. how do we close that gap? How do we make this a more mobile society for children and their families without addressing that? Is it possible to only work from the bottom up?
It's possible, but apparently it doesn't work. We've been doing that now for decades. And when I go back to the war on poverty back in the mid-'60s, and we actually paid attention to low income, and the president visited the Appalachia area, and all of a sudden money and programs and opportunities were being afforded, we saw a reduction of 20% in the number of those living in poverty in about a 3-year period. And then immediately we get a new administration, we get new mindsets, and all of a sudden those support programs, those safety nets, those opportunities go away. And now, since then, we've watched our poverty rate continually climb throughout the country, and certainly here in Michigan, because again, you know, we give them enough to call it a safety net. We don't give them enough to lift them up, and we don't have anybody at the top, you know, reaching out to help out. So.
Is part of the issue the fact that we do have potentially extreme changes in policy from one administration to another, that there hasn't been a real consistent policy agenda in addressing poverty in this nation and in the state?
I think yes is the short answer to your question. There is a variation in the philosophy, but they tend to be, at least from my point of view, pretty straightforward. And that is, on the one side, we've had administrations coming out of the 80s, presidential administrations, more or less on one side, that focused on the notion that poor people could be punished into complying with doing what's necessary. And that is to say, there were rules that would take away privilege, that would take away some of the resources that poor people need, based on an assumption of motivating them by punishing them. That if you if you shorten the number of months for which you can get aid, or if you limit the subsidy for housing, or if you limit the subsidy for training and childcare, that people would be so hurt and so punished by those activities that it would motivate them to want to do for themselves the way that it worked for immigrants when they first came to the U.S. In other words, deprivation as a source of motivation. On the other side, of course, are those who believe that you do need some structural constraints around what you give to people, but essentially you believe that if people are given the opportunity and that they're provided with sources of support, that they would lift themselves out, that they're going to take advantage of opportunity, and that we don't have to serve as sort of a paternalistic father to punish people into correcting their behavior and pulling themselves out of poverty. You can look at, to give you specifics, Charles Murray was a political scientist who wrote about losing ground. He informed the policy for the Reagan administration. And following from that, there were another set of scholars who used a theory called the broken glass theory, or broken windows theory, in communities, which looked at that if you cleaned up community, and they had programs called weeding and seeding, if you did those things that were necessary to put a pretty face on deprivation, that people would feel good about themselves, and they would change their behavior, and they would lift themselves out. Then you get contrasting policies, with the exception of Bill Clinton. You get, because he sort of rode the fence a little bit on poverty reduction kinds of policies, but you would get on the Democratic side policies that essentially focused on providing opportunity and restoring resources and support based on the kind of research that we know would help people, such as you mentioned, housing opportunities for training, for networking, microeconomic opportunities that would allow people to borrow money, to develop small businesses, things of that nature.
Dustin, as you're getting started in your reporting and really digging in, Are you starting to connect any dots between policies that exist in Michigan and people's ability or lack thereof to move out of poverty? Are you starting to see any connections yet?
A little bit. I mean, I think, broadly speaking, one of the things that's happened in the past 5 years, we all know that resources have been cut back everywhere at the state level. They've been cut back for private groups, for philanthropic groups. And we want to believe that we've gotten smarter about how to spend our money. But I think there are certainly particular cases where we're not doing more with less, we're just doing less with less. So you can see some of those instances. But I would say that you still find lots of groups who are working on improving opportunities. And to the question earlier about entrepreneurship, there are lots of organizations in Grand Rapids even that are working on entrepreneurship for minorities and for people in low-income neighborhoods. And maybe that's been the most surprising thing, is that for every problem, there are 5 agencies that are there to deal with it. And maybe one of the bigger issues that we need to focus on is coordination. I know that's something that probably, Jim, you talk about a lot, and a lot of agencies talk about. And I think that's where sort of the state is heading next, as to how do we make sure that everyone is sort of working together, and that they're, that we're getting the best outcome for the money that we do have.
Jim, do you want to speak to that a little bit about coordination? Because as Dustin said, there are lots of organizations out there. Are there enough?
Are there enough? Yes. Is there a need for coordination? Yes. And quite often, all these different groups, these different organizations do different things. And so it's important for the organizations to communicate. Whether it's 911, which is a call center that has a data bank as to where you go for help. If it's your local church that raises funds in order to help you with your utility bills or with food supplies, your local food bank, certainly the community action agencies, which do just so many different programs. There is a need for communication and cooperation and partnerships, and I do think a lot of that exists already. But quite frankly, when things are going well, when we all have funds to spend and programs to offer, we tend to silo up. And then when a time like now, where we're being adversely impacted by federal government decisions, we're being hugely negatively impacted by state government decisions, we start to talk to each other again, because the resources start to dwindle, and the need to understand what each of us is capable of doing at this moment in time. And since, like I say, the community action agencies have been at it since the mid-'60s, so they're used to feast and famine. They're used to rolling with it. And so 3 years ago when President Obama stepped in and he made the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act available, just as one example, he sent $250 million to the state of Michigan for weatherizing low-income homes. And our agency stepped up, and they hired hundreds and hundreds of people, and they helped all kinds of community businesses by contracting with local contractors to do work on these homes. They put well over 40,000 homes back into a health and safety and warmth issue, cut utility bills. Now, all of a sudden, they're talking about cutting the weatherization assistance program altogether. How do you work with that? How do you prepare for that? How do you project a future? How do you keep the ball rolling when you can't count on any kind of consistent business plan, if you will, from the people who right now have the control, which is the government? So,
I think Jim's point is excellent. We are in a quagmire in the country, in as much as our economy is cyclical, and if we look back to the Great Depression forward, we've had these periods of growth followed by these periods of decline. And the most recent period of decline has thrust people whom we would otherwise not think of at risk for being poor, all of a sudden needing services. Many of the traditional services we offer, many of the traditional poverty programs need to be reinforced, but as Jim said, they are there. But we also need it to be organic. In other words, the new poor are not people who fit the stereotype or the images we have. We have people who have been who've lost their jobs, been laid off, and this has really been going on since the 80s, who don't understand what it is like to apply for assistance, don't know where to go. And these are people, some of whom are, high school diploma, college degrees. A major issue is benefits access, and they don't know what to do. They haven't ever been involved in a situation where they've had to depend on public assistance. So I think while on the one hand we have a steady sort of set of services for poor people, we need to also continually pay attention to the need for evolving services based on the evolving new poor.
There was a story on NPR about a week ago about a program in California where rather than just applying a policy, they actually went into a community and said, what do you need? Tell us what's going to help you be successful. And this really incredible program emerged that was part support group, part microfinancing, part healthcare, part drug abuse assistance. It was this really interesting mix, but it was incredibly successful because they gave people a chance to say, this is what I need, and then they listened. It seems like what I'm hearing you say is that our policies as they're structured right now don't necessarily keep up with what is an increasingly shifting face of what it means to be poor in this country.
Yeah, I think an interesting concept that all boards for community action agencies are tripartite boards. So there's 1/3 business, 1/3 individuals who are actually using our services, and then 1/3 of just general community members at large, if you will. And when you get those three groups in the same room talking about it, the education that they all receive from each other is phenomenal. So maybe you should start, Jennifer, promoting that our state government should be made up of 1/3 individuals who are living at one socioeconomic level and 1/3 at another and so forth. And maybe we'd get a lot further if they understood each other's needs. So.
It's interesting that in preparing to come here, I was looking, Jim, at some of the reports from the Voices for Action Poverty Reduction Initiative. And what you will find is that some regions in the state of Michigan offer foreclosure assistance, right? Is that about poverty, or is that about, a person who's been catapulted into a situation where they're about to go into poverty? Because in America, owning a house is a major sort of a barrier from becoming instantly poor. The equity you have in your home, or the ability to use your home to borrow funds, those sorts of things. Those people are at risk of that. And these community action agencies that traditionally focus on poverty are offering foreclosure assistance, which I think you may not find, you would find as important in a middle class neighborhood as you would in a mixed income neighborhood at this point.
Steve, I want to check time real quickly to see where we are. We're okay. I want to get, I'm used to Michigan radio listeners being very talkative. And I want to hear from folks who have joined us this evening. You have sort of an idea of what this project is about, what State of Opportunity is about. What are you hoping to hear us cover? Are there areas in this, we have a question back there, Steve, things that as we're covering this that you think we all need a better understanding of, invisible communities, things like that? We have a question here. Yeah.
Thank you for this forum. I recently attended the Republican primary debate that was held in Granville. And I wrote a question about child poverty, because the Senate or the Congress had recently denied or proposed cutting funding for food stamps and poor services that affected child poverty. And I heard also on Michigan radio that child poverty has increased in Michigan remarkably. And the question wasn't even read. No one wanted to hear about a question of child poverty. Instead, Sharia law was asked and discussed, term limits, which I think I agree with Jack Lessenberry that has to end. But why not? Why not? Why can't we can have a discussion of, you know, why is that such a hard issue for one side to even bring up? That's my question.
And I don't know that we would limit it to just the one side. I think it's a difficult thing to talk about. Anybody here want to respond to that? Why do you think it's difficult for us to talk about poverty? Why is it such a challenging subject? Is it because we have to also look at privilege? Is it because race sort of invariably becomes a part of that discussion as well? What is it? And the panel, I'm more than willing to hear from you on that too.
Well, if folks living in poverty won't admit they're living in poverty, why would anybody not in poverty want to talk about it? The political platforms are very clear, and the Republican debate that you went to, or the forum that you went to, I mean, they're primarily about tax breaks for businesses and tax breaks for the wealthy, and somehow that's going to have the trickle-down effect and create all these, you know, good-paying jobs and opportunities for those who are less fortunate, and they're not going to change that message. That's what carries them. So, and if you talk to state legislators, most of them don't believe they have any poverty in their area. They have folks that, you know, maybe aren't doing as well right now, or maybe hit a glitch or whatever, but for the most part, there is no poverty in their area. There's just folks that aren't doing as well as others, and it is a dirty word for so many people. And fortunately, I mean, I was looking at the Lansing State Journal this weekend, and on 2 days out of the 3, they brought up poverty and how it has to become a political issue. And I agree with them. It's time to start talking about it.
Well, I guess I would say that's part of why we are focusing on opportunity, because that is, at least if you look at the polling, that is something that all Americans are interested in. So if for some reason poverty is something that does allow people to retreat into various preset philosophies, opportunity is something that mostly we all believe in, and I think the facts are there that if you are, the less money you have, the less opportunity you have. So I think, I do think that there is more openness to having that discussion, the discussion on opportunity. I've seen, you start to see more op-eds. I think we will hear about it in the presidential race. I think we'll hear about opportunity. You might not get the specific question you were hoping for, but I think I'm hearing more and more that people are ready to talk about opportunity.
And we were even very careful as we were figuring out what to call this project. I mean, we spent a lot of time sort of poring over what do you call it so that people don't check out as soon as they hear the title. And opportunity, we came up with that as being the area of focus that everyone could people could get behind. You have a question?
Yeah, how are you guys doing today? My name's Nathan. Just to respond to your question first, Jen, why do we sweep poverty under the rug in America? Because it's not the American way. We don't want to admit America has failed to help the poor. So, I mean, that's a big thing why we're sweeping it under the rug. No one wants to admit it, that other places in the world have more advancement opportunities than America, even though we still are a unique and diverse country. So that's number one, why we're sweeping it under the rug. Second thing, we've all heard about entrepreneurship. We talked a lot about entrepreneurship. Kids these days, my generation, we want to be social entrepreneurs. We want to open up that brewery that's also going to go and mow your local city park. You'll get Detroit Mower Gang, they're mowing the parks for free. So entrepreneurship, but especially social entrepreneurship, is a big thing. But in America, entrepreneurship is illegal. If you're a poor person, you're lucky enough to have a home and you want to rent that house out, that's illegal. If you're a home brewer and you want to sell your beer, well, that's illegal. We have thousands of entrepreneurs in Detroit. We call them drug dealers and we lock them up. So these people are meeting a market demand. They're making a profit, and they've been just marginalized completely. They've been, shut down. We're throwing them in jail. We have mass incarceration, and then that feeds into the poverty too. the same incarceration. We lock these people up, we marginalize them. We have a society where, you know, you screw up once and you're no longer a citizen. You no longer have the right to vote in some states. So we've taken poor people, we've taken criminals, we've taken entrepreneurs, we've marginalized them, we've shut them down, we've made anything you can do to make money illegal unless you're a giant corporation. I'm a Michigan certified pesticide applicator. I'll tell you what, okay, it was easy for me to pass my test because I studied. But then when I went to go get a commercial license, well, guess what? The Department of Agriculture had a bunch of questions, and they didn't want to get, excuse me, they didn't want to grant us a license to make money on something that I already passed a state test that said I'm certified to do this by the state. Meanwhile, True Green Chemilon, a billion-dollar corporation, they fry people's lawns all over the state, and you know, but they've got their license from the MDA. So I mean, we love regulation and stuff. We love protecting the people from the big bad rich corporations that are going to exploit us. But in that process, we've outlawed entrepreneurship, and we've really squashed opportunity in America.
Thank you for your comment. So there's his idea, his thought that there are these barriers to opportunity, that there are barriers to entrepreneurship. Is that a major issue, or is it something more core than that? Is there something more basic that we need to address in order to have a real conversation about poverty in the country and in Michigan?
I think that there is something that structurally, I think what he alludes to are a series of sort of connected systemic elements that form a structure that prohibit people from doing creative entrepreneurship. I think in relationship to poverty, it goes back again to your earlier question. To what extent are we limiting people who don't seem to meet our judgment in terms of qualifications or preparation, and therefore what are we doing to deprive them of opportunity? We know that, for example, quite a number of poor people engage in what we call the black market. It is, they go around the rules to make it. Mm-hmm. And yet we punish them because, you know, we've shut them off from legitimate activities, but we punish them for going into illegal activities where they're trying to do well. And I'm not at all justifying that they should engage in illegal activity, but I'll give you a very simple ironic example. I worked with a poor family once, and they wanted to take the kids to the movie. We were organizing to take the kids to the movie theater. And it was something as simple as this. They didn't have enough money to buy popcorn. So the mothers decided to pop popcorn for the kids so that they could take it in the movie, except that it's illegal. So here I was trying to help these kids sneak bags of popcorn into the theater, something for which they could be punished. But that's a simple symbolic example of the ways in which sometimes poor people try to be very creative, and sometimes their creativity hedges across the fence into illegality. And I think that we are able to systematically connect the dots to say that that occurs across the board in housing, in education, in the ways in which we hoard or spread information about opportunity, and so on and so forth.
Now, our project is really focused on children, but clearly we can't talk about the experience children have in this state without talking about their families, about their parents, about birth outcomes. One of the most disturbing things to me when we first started the project was looking at how dismal the birth outcomes in Michigan are for children who live in poverty. I can't remember the exact statistics, but the number of children who will not make it beyond their first year of life if they're born into poverty. And the rates in Michigan rival those of some developing nations. I mean, it's startling. When we look at something like that, it seems the problem, there's something more basic that is that is problematic that we can't quite put our hands on. If mothers aren't accessing health care when they're pregnant or don't have access to health care, and thus their child is born less healthy than they need to be to survive their first year, then there's something really problematic at work. But getting to what that is, I guess it's what I'm trying to figure out. What is that thing? Is it apathy? Is it lack of investment? Is it something structural? What?
Well, again, Jennifer, they're all accurate. But getting back to the entrepreneur question, I mean, how does someone think about being an entrepreneur when they're not even getting 3 square meals a day? When you're given $1.50 to try to create a meal for a family of 4 on a weekly basis, you can't think beyond survival. So structurally speaking, I mean, we've got to get beyond that idea that we've got to do more than just help them survive. We've got to help them thrive, and eventually they'll get to the entrepreneurship and education and so forth. To the governor's credit, that is one area that he has picked up on, is the child mortality rate in Michigan. He finds it unacceptable, as everyone should, and he's put that on his radar to do something about it. That's a start. We've got a laundry list we could give him that, to continue that process in order to get where we need to be as a society.
I think one key to your question is to understand poverty as a series of what we would call cascading events. So while you can isolate something like teen birth rates or infant mortality, those are usually connected to many, many other things that are part of a sort of systematic network in which poor people are caught up in that deprives them in many instances of opportunities that would allow them to lead optimal kinds of lives. So cascading events, it isn't ever, I think, a single event in the lives of poor people. There are a whole bunch of things that are going on all at once, often for them, that put them in their circumstances.
Are you finding that, Dustin? Some of the families you're covering, we're following several families over the course of the project. Is that what you're starting to find?
Yeah, I think those statistics are all concerned. You can look at any individual indicator and be concerned about it. The teen pregnancy rates are very high. The infant mortality rates are very high. The percent of mothers who smoke during their pregnancy is high. Those are all related things, and sometimes we're talking about the same mothers. I will say that one of the things that I found interesting is that there's more and more emphasis on doing home visits for pregnant mothers and for children who are small, up until toddler age. I think one of the most troubling things about our infant mortality statistics, and there are many troubling things, to hear that so many children don't make it through their first year of life. Perhaps the most troubling thing is that it's more common for the children to not make it through their first year if they're born black or they're born Hispanic. And there are organizations around the state, and there's specifically organizations in this city, in this county, that are targeting that. And so I've been along on some visits where, a social worker will visit, a nurse will visit, and they'll talk to the parent about making sure that the child has a safe place to sleep. When I had my baby, we had a baby shower, and we got a crib, and and we looked at it, and I shook the rails, but a lot of these people, the baby is sleeping on a mattress, or they just can't afford to buy these types of things. Having a baby is expensive. So I think having social workers and nurses in those homes is one of the ways that people are starting to deal with that. We also just got an announcement today that later this week the governor is announcing another program. We'll see how different that is and what else they're going to do with that.
Thank you. You begin to touch on a question that I have because first, a little comment. Normally, when we talk about poverty in America, we automatically associate that with race. And race and poverty in America are synonymous in many people's eyes. So people will focus on infant mortality rates in Core City, Grand Rapids. Television cameras will come out to Core City, Grand Rapids. But the same levels of impoverishment and rates of impoverishment happen in northern Kent County, around Sparta, but they're not as concentrated. And one of the problems, from my own commentary and my own observation of living in this region for too long, is that that race plays out the factor. So when we want to talk about poverty, people say, "Oh, you know, you're doing something for those black or brown people, and not for all of us." And if we don't touch that subject in Michigan, which I grew up in the South as a child, and Michigan is a far more racist place than I've ever lived in my life. I mean, and it's far more divided. And if we don't touch that subject, then we can't handle the divisions of race and class that come along. And I think we're just skirting around the issue if we're not talking about the kind of racial factors. People on this side of the state talk about Detroit, and when they use Detroit, you know what they mean. That's where black people are, and over here we're good white people. And no offense to anyone from West Michigan, but that's how you talk. And so we need to kind of come back and talk about this. There are specific dynamics, disproportionately numbers of blacks and browns who are impoverished. So I would like the panelists to really address this issue and not skirt around this issue, because I'm sorry, Michigan Radio, and I'm a Michigan alum. You don't want to touch this issue, and this is a really important one to touch.
Well, I think what you're saying is interesting, but for a couple of reasons. Because when we look at who accesses programs, there is an idea that African American people access programs more than other groups, but the statistics about that don't bear out. So I think you're right. I don't know your name. Hello. That race eventually emerges as part of this conversation, but how does it fit into a conversation about poverty? How do those two things work in tandem?
It's difficult to talk about what I'd like. Another way of thinking of poverty is social class status. It's difficult to talk about social class status without talking about race. And in many instances, African Americans, Hispanics, and others are automatically relegated to a lower class status because of their racial identity. Now, what that means beyond that would probably take hours to debate, but we know, for example, that disproportionately African Americans represent higher numbers of poor people, but they aren't the total numbers of poor people. So you would find, as you move out of urban areas, you would find just as many non-African Americans accessing service as you would others. But that's a whole nother conversation. It's difficult to wrap myself around that, other than to say that they are overlapping. Race and poverty, or what I would like to call at this time social class status, overlap considerably.
And just to the gentleman who asked the question, we're in what, month 2 or 3 of this project? We've got 3 years. And I think we're kind of feeling our way through this too, and figuring out how to talk about the entire issue of poverty with this focus on children. And it's proving to be a challenge.
Yeah, well, we've had a lot of conversations about this, and hopefully you will be hearing more. And one of the things that's the challenge that I have with it is something that you sort of addressed in your question, was that if you look at the statistics, it is impossible to deny that there is a racial component to these problems we're talking about. The outcomes are worse depending on skin color. But as someone whose responsibility is to talk on the air, I also don't want to leave people with the impression that this is just a problem in one community, you know? You don't want to contribute to a stereotype, but you also don't want to ignore a problem. So this is something we've been wrestling with in our staff meetings and our emails to each other. It's something we talk about every day, and hopefully you can judge us as we go forward, and I'll give you my card. You can email me. Yeah. But I think it's an important thing that, and I hope we can do it right. I hope we can talk about it right, because you're right. It does need to be talked about.
Hi, my name's Ruth, and I pastor here, and I've pastored in New York, and I've pastored in Chicago. And so this is a weird place to be, but we've been here for a decade. I was at the Children's Defense Fund that met last week with Marion Wright Edelman, and Jennifer Guerra was there. So when you asked, Jennifer White, when you asked, what do we want asked? For me, the biggest thing is that racism, the explicit problem of racism is addressed. West Michigan won't deal with it. We won't deal with it as a justice issue. We will not deal with it as a theological issue. We ignore it. We pretend like it's not a factor. Dustin, I appreciate what you're saying about not wanting to tilt it, but the reality is if something smells, name what it is, and it smells. In terms of what I'd love to see is that you deal with the cradle to prison pipeline. And with the number of African American males who are imprisoned, it's quintupled since 1980. The babies whose daddies are in prison in the state of Michigan, so often we put them in the UP. It has devastated families. Not many people talk about that. In terms of what I want to see is how communities can work together. In Chicago, especially when I pastored on the South Side, we worked together with tutoring kids, recognizing it takes a village, that if somebody's being raised by a single mother, how do we surround them? We don't do a good job here. We talk Jesus all the time, but we don't live Jesus, just saying. Gun violence, it's a small problem in Grand Rapids compared to Detroit and Chicago, but if we don't deal with lack of opportunity, lack of jobs, it will get worse. Charter schools, charter schools, my mentors have always taught me, follow the money. There is something funky about the money with the charter schools. No names mentioned, but the children of God who are running the charter schools, some of them have told me that they make a lot of money. Why is that? Why is it that Snyder, rather than dealing with folks in the school, just as I pulled in the parking lot, talked about how failing schools get turned over to charter schools? Who's getting the money? Where does that come from? Somebody better ask those questions. And then in terms of child mortality rate, and then in terms of the good, because I know you guys, it's a 3-year project. Thank God for the Kellogg Foundation. Thank God you guys are doing it. Very cool. In terms of the good, because I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed and I'm like, that's right, I'm going back to Chicago, I'm going back to New York, and my brother who lives in Greenwich, Connecticut is like, girl, you want your baby to go to University of Illinois, University of Connecticut, Rutgers, or U of M or Michigan State. So we have some of the best state schools, but there's not access. So those are just a little bit of my questions after a week at Children's Defense Fund. Thanks.
And I'd love to hear from other folks here if you have specific concerns as we're covering this over the next 3 years, things you'd like to hear.
Hi there. I can't help but reference Malcolm Gladwell because I'm reading his books right now, and he's just so good at illustrating what works. And what I would love to hear is what works. I mean, as journalists, hopefully you can find some people who have made it out. And if we could hear, and if poor people could hear, because I doubt there are a lot of poor people here, to tell you the truth right now, but if other poor people, everyone can hear what works. Like, what are the technical things that got you out of this neighborhood? Was it getting financial aid? Was it getting more food stamps? Was it getting daycare? Was it getting a social worker to come into your house and help you care for your baby properly? Was it a role model? Was it something in the schools? I mean, a diagram. I would love to see portraits, different portraits of what works and what people have done to make it work. Because that's what you can, I mean, that's what you learn from, what works, not, you know, kind of, I mean, of course we have to dwell on all the crappy things. I mean, that's what the news is all about, right? But just to see something different, to like pluck us out of that whole mindset of everything sucks.
I think one of the challenges we face in this business is really being careful. I think you're talking about Outliers. Is this the book Outliers? Okay, all of them. It's being careful. You know, we're not an advocacy organization. It's not what we do. but I think we are conscious about reinforcing, well, I'll speak for myself, about reinforcing the bootstrap idea. And I think when we look at people who have escaped poverty, who have gone from maybe being born into poverty to being enormously successful, that there were specific people and specific things and opportunities that presented themselves that made it possible for them to make it from point A to point B that may not, it's luck in some cases. It's just luck, or having that one person who's really interested in you and willing to mentor you through the process. So I think that's an important point, that the success stories are important too, but I think also being careful to balance out how realistic is it that those same set of circumstances are going to line up for every person who's living in poverty. But I agree. I hope all the news you hear on the station isn't bad. I hope some of it's a little up with people. But no, thank you for that.
Yeah, and
He's coming back. Hold on one second.
yeah, well, I could hear you. I don't know.
I know what you're saying exactly, and I hate that whole bootstrap thing too, because there is so many people just get lucky, but there are realities of what does work, and that's what I guess I should have focused on was these things work. This is proven to work. This worked for this person. If somebody hears, well, they did it that way, then maybe I can do it that way. So in spite of that is kind of what I was saying.
I would say I hope you do hear those stories. Just last week I had a story of 5 ways that people are able to climb the economic ladder. It was very generalized. This Wednesday our story is sit down with Jeffrey Canada, who runs the Harlem Children's Zone. You mentioned someone here was at the Children's Defense Fund conference. So we'll be hearing from Jeffrey Canada on Wednesday, and he'll have some of those ideas. We'll have quite a bit of those stories, I'm hoping.
Hello, I'm Brian from Kalamazoo, and just wanted to, I would love to hear more about mentoring programs for those who are impoverished. I think quite often that's a great way to affect a lot of populations without a high overhead cost involved in that. A little bit of volunteer effort, a lot of advertising to get there. Also would love to hear more about removing barriers, not just the barriers from social service systems, public social service systems, but private nonprofits often have barriers that stop recipients from receiving services, whether it's drugs, whether it's alcohol, or non-compliance in particular types of rules or programs. And also, we're preaching to the choir here, so I want to hear more about how to talk to folks who don't necessarily believe in social service systems, how to broach those subjects with others who may need to know more about that. Thank you.
One of the questions the Kellogg Foundation had for us when we were applying for this grant was who are you really going to reach with this project? If your average listener is educated and already civically engaged, aren't you, in fact, preaching to the choir? Part of what we're doing with these events is trying to get out into the community to hopefully pull in a more diverse group of people who are willing to talk, however you fall on the issue, because without that conversation and coming to a place of understanding about why each side feels the way it does, we kind of get stuck. Just in the policy debate, we get stuck right there. The other thing we're doing is building, in partnership with a group called Michigan's Children, we're building a self-advocacy guide. Because we're not an advocacy organization, we can't teach you, we can't, advocate a position. But what we have found is that people who live in poverty don't really know how to advocate for themselves. They don't know how to tell their own story. They don't know who's my senator, who's my congressman, who do I talk to if I don't like this policy? How do I organize my community behind an idea that I have? And so that's one of the things we're trying to leave behind at the end of the 3 years is a foundation for people to become better self-advocates. So that's how we're hoping to address some of that. Yes, Steve.
Hi, Jennifer. Hi. Some of the first things I heard on the questions talking about children in poverty and children's poverty. And I think that's sometimes our issue, is that it's really not children. My grandchildren and my children had no income until they were about 14 or 15. So they're not the ones that are really in poverty. Everybody wants to talk about kid poverty, but no one wants to talk about young women in poverty. And certainly we don't want to talk about young women who live in a big city in poverty. And the young woman over here said that she wanted to meet someone or say, how do people get out of poverty? Well, I am one of those people who got out of poverty along with my 8 brothers and sisters. But I can tell you, we didn't do self-advocacy. And I don't think self-advocacy when you're poor and you have 8 brothers and sisters and your father makes $3,000 a year for working full-time and your mother cuts hair on the side and takes care of her kids is going to work. But I think what is going to work is what it worked for my family, which is public education, opportunity for all, and not different opportunity for people who live in the city of Grand Rapids versus people who live in Rockford or East Grand Rapids. And I'm not from this area, but I work in this area. So that's my first comment. The second thing I would like to say...
Can I respond to that really quickly just so I can clarify?
Or entrepreneurship or whatever you want to call it.
But those programs, education, public programs, they are a result of policies that are formed by our elected officials. If people who are living in poverty, if they're not voting for their own interests, if they're not
I think that's,
their
again,
own voice.
Blaming the victim. They're not voting enough. You know, therefore it's their fault they're in poverty. I look at it this way, differently, you know, in saying that several times people mentioned our governor today who cut the earned tax credit for low-income families. I work at Grand Valley State University, and I'm a manager, and I see how much public education funds are cut and what the percentage now versus when I started working there 12 years ago is of the percentage that's paid by the state or federal government versus out-of-pocket expenditures. I have personally taken up collections for books year after year, semester after semester for students because no longer does the Pell program cover books, which can run you $300 a semester. So that's all I have to say. And I think the other thing I would like to propose is for the city of Grand Rapids that our mayor think about policy too. When he ran first, I came from Providence, Rhode Island, and I remember about that time he ran as mayor for the first time, and I voted for him because what he said he would do, that he would have a equal pay wage, a public wage or a status wage, an equal for work pay wage for the city of Grand Rapids so that it paid an earned income that was above poverty rate, et cetera, that would give equal opportunity for all people that live in the city of Grand Rapids. And I haven't seen that implemented, and that would be a fabulous policy. Thank you.
So you're going to use so then you're using your voting power to advocate for your concerns, for things you're concerned about.
Yes,
and I think that's what we're trying to get to.
But it's much easier for me because I can afford the drinks and I work and I can afford to get down here. But I think people in poverty, you know I wouldn't have been able to when I was 22 with 3 kids.
Yeah. Mel? Yes, go ahead.
I'm Charlotte from Mason, and I want to say I just see a connection between poverty and the election this November. I think Michigan is one of 30 states that now has a photo ID law. I'm hearing more frequently as it gets closer to election time that people know that they need a birth certificate to get their photo IDs. I'm assuming that people don't have the knowledge, the means of transportation, or the money to get their birth certificates. Therefore, they can't get their photo IDs, and I'm hearing people saying already that they know that they can't vote. And because I think poverty has a lot to do with this, I think a lot of poor people are going to be disenfranchised, and we're really not going to hear their voice in this election, which is disturbing to me.
I want to turn to our panel as we're wrapping this up. when you look at the issue of poverty in the state, in the country, if you had to choose a thing that you think is the most essential thing to turning it, I know, Jim, I've asked you this before, and you always win. Is it a change in policy? Is it a policy shift, or is it something else that you think needs to happen in order for the tide to change?
Okay, I'll try one more time with you. At the core, I think we need an attitude change. When I was growing up, we were taught to take care of our neighbors, to look out for each other. If there was somebody in need, you took care of that. We've moved so far off of that needle to the other extreme. And so I would like to see an attitude change in Michigan and nationally. And where that starts, I don't care. It would be helpful if it would start with our governments. But wherever it starts, I just think we need an attitude change as to what's the value, and what is it we need to do in order to make everybody better. And it's the truth, is that if you help the poorest and the weakest among you, we all benefit from that. So I'll give you that one, Jennifer. How about attitude change? All right.
Before we go, I'd just like to let you know that we do have a sign-up over there. If you want to know about other events, we'll be back in Grand Rapids over the course of the 3 years of the project to have these conversations, sometimes in a little more formal setting, sometimes with beer or whatever you choose to drink, which personally I kind of like, even though I can't drink while I'm doing it. But you can sign up and just let us know that you are interested. Also, one of the other tools we're using during this project is the PIN network. And this is where we're building up a sort of on-the-ground source of information. People who have stories they think are important to tell, we want to connect with you and see if there's a story that fits into what we're doing. So I don't know, did you bring any PIN information with you? But you can sign up on our website, michiganradio.org, which is easy to remember. Dustin, just to look ahead, what are we going to be hearing in the next couple of weeks?
So this Wednesday's story, Jennifer Guerra went to the Children's Defense Fund conference in Ohio and sat down with Jeffrey Canada, who's the head of the Harlan Children's Zone, which if you haven't heard about it, it is kind of the model for how a lot of service organizations that help children, they sort of look at that, and it's gotten a lot of attention. In the next couple of weeks, as I said this week, I think the governor's going to announce a new plan on infant mortality, so that may lead to next week's story. So we'll be hearing a lot more. I have probably 20 hours of tape that I need to edit. I probably have 10 stories just in my computer right now.
We'll be looking forward to hearing that. Our next call-in show will be, I believe in October, we'll be looking at the question of power and privilege and how that feeds into the discussion of poverty in the state. So thank you all for joining us this evening. It was a great discussion. We hope to see you next time. Join us again next time we're out here. Thanks so much.